In the 1970s, Hollywood imagined futures that looked perfect until you looked closer. Logan's Run was sold as a sleek sci-fi fantasy. Beautiful people, endless pleasure, a clean, colorful world where even danger was supposed to look attractive. That included the people in it. Behind the scenes, though, the movie was shaped less by story and more by fear. Fear of ratings, fear of backlash, fear of making audiences uncomfortable. So scenes were softened, ideas were trimmed, explanations disappeared, but some things were allowed to stay. The result is a film that looks polished, seductive, and safe, while hiding a lot of uncomfortable decisions underneath. These are 16 weird facts about Logan's Run. The studio compromises, casting choices, and quiet censorship that explain why this future never quite adds up. Number 16. MGM marketed Logan's Run as a youth fantasy, not a death story. When Logan's Run was released in 1976, MGM's marketing deliberately avoided the film's central concept of mandatory death. Posters, trailers, and taglines emphasized youth, beauty, sex, and spectacle, selling the movie as a futuristic adventure rather than a story about state-enforced execution. The studio downplayed the fact that every character was required to die at a fixed age and avoided framing the film as a warning or social critique. Even the word death was largely absent from promotional materials. Instead, the focus was placed on the domed city, the carousel spectacle, and the promise of pleasure. This wasn't accidental. MGM was positioning Logan's Run as a mass-market science fiction hit, not a confrontational dystopia. That marketing decision set expectations before audiences ever saw the film, and it explains why so many of the movie's harsher ideas were later softened to match the image the studio had already sold. Number 15. The age of death was raised, so Hollywood could cast adults. In the original novel, citizens were executed at the age of 21. For the film, that number was raised to 30, not because the story demanded it, but because the studio did. A big-budget movie needed recognizable adult actors, and killing people in their early 20s made casting far more difficult. The change solved a practical problem, but it came at a cost. Raising the age softened the shock of the premise and made the system feel less extreme. It also forced the movie to quietly adjust its logic, since the society now depended on people living long enough to build careers, relationships, and authority before being eliminated. What looks like world building on the surface was really a casting compromise, and it was one of the first signs that Logan's Run would keep reshaping its ideas. Not to sharpen them, but to make them easier to sell. Number 14. Logan's Run was almost much darker, until MGM got nervous. Early versions of Logan's Run leaned harder into despair, control, and inevitability. The society wasn't meant to feel sleek or inviting, it was supposed to feel suffocating. But as the budget grew and MGM realized how much money was riding on the film, the studio began to pull back. The darker edges were softened before production fully locked. Moments that lingered too long on hopelessness or cruelty were treated as risks, not strengths. The goal shifted from challenging the audience to keeping them comfortable. That decision didn't remove the darkness entirely, it diluted it. The movie still hints at a brutal system, but it rarely commits to making the viewer sit with it. What remains is a film that looks bold, but constantly flinches at the last second. Number 13. Farrah Fawcett was cast after Michael York spotted her offset. Farrah Fawcett's appearance in Logan's Run wasn't the result of a long casting search or a studio plan. She was cast because Michael York noticed her in real life and suggested her to the production. At the time, she wasn't yet a major star. The timing couldn't have been better. Just months after Logan's Run was released, Charlie's Angels premiered and turned Fawcett into a cultural phenomenon. What had been a small supporting role in a sci-fi film suddenly became part of her origin story. It's one of those moments where casting feels almost accidental. A casual recommendation ended up linking Logan's Run to one of the most iconic pop culture explosions of the late 1970s, something no one involved could have predicted at the time. Number 12. The movie nearly became even sexier, until the budget panicked. Early costume concepts for Logan's Run were far more revealing than what ended up on screen. The idea was to fully lean into the image of a pleasure-driven society, using exposed skin as part of the world's visual language. But the pullback didn't come from morality or ratings concerns, it came from money. More exposed skin meant more time in makeup, more lighting considerations, and higher daily costs. As the budget kept climbing, the studio quietly scaled the designs back. What survived was a compromise. The film kept its sensual look, but not to the extent originally planned. Even the future's sex appeal, it turns out, had to answer to the budget spreadsheet. Number 11. Logan's Run explains almost nothing about how its world works. The film throws viewers into its futuristic society and rarely stops to explain the rules that actually make it function. How reproduction works, how consent is handled, how population is replaced, even how the system enforces obedience beyond the Sandmen is left vague. This wasn't subtle world building, it was a mission. The movie prioritizes momentum and visuals over clarity, moving quickly past questions that might slow the pace or make the audience uncomfortable. As a result, the world of Logan's Run feels detailed on the surface, but strangely hollow underneath. You're meant to accept it, not understand it. And once you notice that, the cracks start to show. Number 10. The PG rating decided what was acceptable. From early on, the studio was determined to secure a PG rating for Logan's Run. That single goal quietly reshaped the movie's emotional limits. Moments of panic were softened, resistance was reduced, and scenes that lingered too long on fear or suffering were trimmed back. The issue wasn't runtime or story clarity. It was tone. Anything that risked making the audience too uncomfortable was treated as a liability. The system had to feel controlled, not cruel. This decision didn't just affect individual scenes, it set the boundaries for what the film was allowed to show and, more importantly, what it was allowed to make the audience feel. And those boundaries would lead to some very selective choices later on. Number 9. Logan's Run nearly tripled its budget mid-production. Logan's Run didn't start as a massive studio gamble. Early on, it was planned as a relatively modest science fiction project. But as the sets expanded, effects grew more ambitious, and technical challenges piled up, the budget quietly spiraled out of control. What began around $3 million ballooned to roughly $9 million, a huge leap for MGM in the mid-1970s. That kind of money changed the studio's attitude overnight. Risk suddenly became something to manage, not embrace. From that point on, decisions weren't just creative, they were defensive. The more expensive the movie became, the more pressure there was to make it accessible, marketable, and safe. And that pressure shows up everywhere in the finished film, even when the story wants to go somewhere darker. Number 8. Entire erotic sequences were removed before release. Several sequences built around the film's pleasure culture were filmed and then removed before release. Among them was a nude ice sculpture display and a longer, more explicit version of the love shop. Scenes meant to underline how casually the society treated intimacy. These weren't trimmed for pacing or story clarity. They were removed because they pushed too close to the rating line the studio was trying to protect. The imagery crossed from suggestion into visibility, and that made executives nervous. What remains in the final cut is a sanitized version of that culture, sexualized enough to sell the idea, but carefully limited so it wouldn't challenge the film's PG label. The society is still indulgent, just never enough to cause trouble. Number 7. Carousel was originally far more disturbing. Carousel is presented as a beautiful ceremony, light, music, and the promise of renewal. But early versions of the sequence leaned harder into panic and resistance. People were supposed to look afraid. Some didn't want to go. The ritual wasn't meant to feel graceful. That tone didn't survive intact. The sequence was softened so audiences wouldn't recoil from what was happening. The deaths became abstract, almost elegant, and the sense of coercion faded into spectacle. The result is one of the film's strangest contradictions. Carousel is the clearest example of mass murder in the story, yet it's staged to feel celebratory. Not because that's what the world would look like, but because that's what the movie could get away with showing. Number 6. Michael York didn't think Logan's Run was a smart career move. Michael York was hesitant to take the role of Logan 5. At the time, he was already an established actor and wasn't convinced that a flashy science fiction film about enforced death would help his career. Sci-fi was still seen as a gamble, not prestige. What changed his mind wasn't the studio or the paycheck, but a conversation. A younger colleague read the script and told York the story mattered, that it was saying something audiences weren't ready to hear yet. That perspective stuck. York accepted the role, a decision that permanently tied his name to Logan's Run. What he saw as a risk at the time became one of the performances he's still most closely associated with, whether he expected that or not. Number 5. Peter Ustinov largely invented his character on set. Peter Ustinov's character feels completely different from everyone else in Logan's Run, and that's because much of him wasn't really written. Large portions of his dialogue and behavior were improvised during filming. Ustinov leaned into a rambling, theatrical style that wasn't strictly on the page, shaping the character as he went. Instead of tightening it down, the production let him run with it, partly because his presence brought warmth and unpredictability to an otherwise rigid world. The result is a character who feels oddly out of place, but memorable. In a movie where so much was carefully controlled and softened, Ustinov's performance stands out as one of the few things that feels loose, human, and slightly uncontained. Number 4. The futuristic guns barely worked during filming. The sleek, futuristic weapons in Logan's Run looked advanced on screen, but on set, they were a constant problem. The props misfired, jammed, and failed so often that scenes had to be stopped and reset repeatedly. Michael York later joked that the guns were some of the least reliable pieces of equipment on the production. Timing shots became frustrating, especially during action scenes that were already tightly choreographed. It's a small detail, but a revealing one. The movie presents a perfectly controlled future, while behind the camera, even the tools of that control struggled to function at all. Number 3. Jessica's costume was approved, even when everything else was cut. While fear, panic, and visible resistance were trimmed to protect the PG rating, one thing was never reconsidered: Jessica's costume. Worn by Jenny Agutter, the outfit was sheer, barely structured, and held together by thin chains, designed to visually sell the film's pleasure-driven society. Agutter later said she hated wearing it and often felt exposed, especially during scenes that required running, physical movement, and stunts. Despite that discomfort, the design remained unchanged throughout production. The contradiction is telling. Violence was softened, suffering was reduced, but sexualized imagery was allowed to stay because it didn't technically violate the rating rules. The line wasn't about exploitation or safety. It was about what the studio believed audiences would accept. Number 2. A Star Trek Vulcan salute somehow made it into the final cut. Right at the end of Logan's run, during the final crowd scene, one extra flashes a Star Trek Vulcan salute. Live long and prosper. It's quick, easy to miss, and completely out of place, and yet it survived. In a movie that went through heavy studio oversight, multiple edits, and constant tone adjustments, that tiny gesture slipped past everyone. No one caught it, or no one thought it mattered enough to remove. It's a strange final detail, a joke from another sci-fi universe quietly embedded in a film obsessed with control. In a world where almost everything was carefully managed, one small act of rebellion made it all the way to the screen. Number 1. Much of Logan's run was never preserved by the studio. After Logan's run completed production, a significant amount of its unused footage, music, and alternate material was never properly archived. During an MGM purge of studio assets in the years that followed, large portions of what had been filmed were discarded or lost. This wasn't unusual for the time, but it permanently locked the film into a single surviving version. Because of that loss, Logan's run has no director's cut, no extended edition, and no definitive reconstruction waiting in a vault. Scenes that were trimmed for tone, rating, or pacing can't be restored. Not because the studio chose not to, but because the material no longer exists. What audiences see today is simply what survived the purge. That context reframes the entire movie. The gaps in logic, the softened moments, and the sense that something is missing aren't mysteries to be solved. They're consequences. Logan's run doesn't feel compromised because it was poorly planned. It feels compromised because parts of it are permanently gone, leaving the theatrical cut as the only version history will ever have. Logan's run isn't strange because it's old. It's strange because it was shaped by hesitation. At every stage, the movie was pulled in two directions. It wanted to be bold, unsettling, and confrontational, but it was constantly softened to stay marketable, affordable, and acceptable. Ideas were trimmed, explanations were avoided, some choices were protected, while others were quietly erased. What survives isn't a single, unified vision. It's a series of compromises frozen into one film. And that's why Logan's run still feels off in a way you can't quite explain. Not because it failed to imagine the future, but because it was never allowed to fully commit to it. If you enjoy uncovering the real stories behind classic sci-fi, the studio decisions, the compromises, and the things that were never meant to be noticed, subscribe. These movies are full of secrets, and this is just one of them.